Everybody, good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Today is Thursday, June 6, 2019, and this broadcast is about vulnerability. There's a famous TED Talk by Brene Brown where she started studying vulnerability and she ended up talking about shame. And I think it's such a strong connection between the two that you can't talk about vulnerability without talking about shame. When I asked my youngest child today, I was driving her and her friend somewhere, and I asked them about what their thoughts are about vulnerability, and they said it's feeling scared or defenseless. And then I asked them if they understood what it meant in the psychological context, and they didn't quite understand what it meant. But I thought their answer about feeling defenseless, like having nothing to protect you, was a really important part of it, an important way to understand it. It's that idea, that feeling that we might get hurt, that we can get hurt. It's taking the risk in situations or just being exposed in situations to people, circumstances, reactions where we can get hurt. And so this idea of creating, fostering, leaning into vulnerability is a really, really powerful one. And I want to say this also as it relates to this as we begin. I was listening to something recently. I don't know if it was a podcast or somebody somewhere, but some self-help expert was talking about fear and worry. And they were saying, worry serves no purpose, doesn't help us at all, just really ruins the present moment. And when I thought about that, and maybe it's just my contrarian thinking, I thought that's not exactly true. Imagine, for example, having alcoholic, abusive parents. Fear in that kind of situation would serve you very well because it would create a hypervigilance. It would create an awareness of the landmines that one could possibly step on. And so fear does serve us. And the more trauma, the more exposure we have had in our life, our brain becomes wired in a certain way to respond with a trauma response or with fear or worry because at one time we were defenseless. And so really what this is a taking an opportunity, creating an opportunity where we expose ourselves to the possibility that which happened to us in our past might happen to us again. But for most of us, we didn't experience it. For most of our children, they didn't experience big T trauma, right? Really obvious, dramatic trauma. Some, of course, experienced it, but for the most part, most people that we work with in our program experience something that looks a lot more like small T trauma. Small T trauma is something that's not as observable and is more subtle. Somebody defined trauma at one point, I heard, as anything less than optimal. And so by that definition, everybody's experienced some trauma. And so because most of us haven't experienced the big T trauma, we experience the small T trauma and we find ourselves being afraid of being hurt and we think something's wrong with us, right? We have no excuse. We think that somehow we're just broken or flawed. But really, through therapy, we find, and this is one of the big pieces out of Evoke, right? This is why we don't talk about behaviorism and symptom management or symptom reduction as most. We lean into, we learn what the symptom is teaching us, what it needs to tell us. We learn what it served. And so, first and foremost, with all of us, we try to discover how the walls that we built to protect us protected us. And when we understand that and demonstrate compassion toward that defense for the person who felt defenseless, we heal it. So that's kind of my preamble to tonight. Vulnerability is a fear of rejection, of being alone. I always talk about it comes from a survival instinct. We as humans are not very impressive on our own. We could not have created all the things that exist in modern societies on our own. We need to depend upon others, not just others in our small groups, in our tribes, in our society, but we need to depend upon generations of people to be able to be as successful of creatures as we are. And so our instinct to fight against, to not risk being rejected, is part of us, right? We need to be in groups. to be successful. We're one of the most pathetic creatures as children. We have for longer than most every creature on earth, we stay with our parents and depend and rely upon our parents. So the risk of rejection is life-threatening, right? It's hardwired into our DNA. We need each other. We need to be taken care of. And so not fitting in, not being loved, not being enough, being judged, being an outcast, that really is something that is part of what makes us human and successful. So when we think about the fear of rejection, when we think about the fear of not being loved, those are parts of us that have helped us to be successful, helped us to adapt. And if there's significant trauma, if our environment is an unsafe one, our brain gets built and wired in a way that it overtakes all of our behavior. I was out in the field yesterday talking to the students, having a group and meeting with some of the students. And it's that same thing. They were trying to figure out what the right thing to do, what the good thing to do, trying to kind of make their way through the program. And in all the cases, I said, let's spend some time looking at where's the truth, where's the energy? Why are you avoiding sharing? One of the boys said to me, I know I need to share. That's the one thing I've learned here is I need to share. And I said, okay, that's a pretty basic, pretty easy thing to learn. But let's talk about why you were afraid to share before. And through some exploration, he came up with a really simple, honest answer where there was a lot of energy, which is if I shared the truth, I was told that my feelings were wrong. And nobody said it using those words, but that was his experience. Right? I was told about the pathology in my feelings. And so he learned to hide them. Right? He learned to not expose himself to opportunities where he would be dismissed or rejected, unloved, unliked, unwelcomed. I talk about this all the time. Our defenses, and this goes with your children. Our defenses protect us from perceived threats. Right? They're there for a reason. And wise people and adequate therapists respect and honor defenses. They don't come in trying to take them away. When they do that, they're not respecting the energy that it takes to build those defenses and where the original wound was. So our defenses protect us from a perceived threat. Our resistance is a resistance to change. This is one of the things I talk about when I'm training therapists. I was just talking to a colleague today explaining this idea. Our resistance is really what we're treating in therapy. It doesn't take any particular talent. First year graduate school students can identify defenses. You're being defensive, you're being resistant, you're justifying, you're minimizing, you're intellectualizing. There's no talent in that. That's not what therapy really is. Therapy is learning to work with resistance. That's essentially what we're in the business of. One of the most insidious forms of resistance, ironically, is compliance. More often than not, and this might surprise some of you because your children may not have been like this at home, but more often than not, what I observe in our program when I go out and visit the field is that kids are trying to say the right thing. They're trying to look good. They're trying to sell to me, to the staff, to the therapists, to their parents, that they're better, that they've learned their lesson. And I often say to them, slow down, let's go back a few steps. There's a long, important space in between kind of how you were struggling and healing. And let's take a look at that. That's a really important part of the process. Shame is an urge in us to go away, to hide, to put away those parts of ourselves that others find upsetting, off-putting, repulsive, frustrating, etc. Right? Anything that we put out there that causes particularly our family of origin, but anybody else for that matter, anything uncomfortable, disappointment, frustration, anger, right? Being upset, anxious, worried, fear even. When we cause, as children, our parents to feel that way, we're inclined to hide those parts of ourselves. So many parents that I talk to get so confused when their children start to say, I didn't feel accepted, I didn't feel loved, I didn't feel heard by you or seen by you. And so many parents do not have that experience and did not intend or feel in any way that they sent that message. And what I explain is that's simply what a child experiences, that the frown on a parent's face, right? The look of discomfort or pain, sadness, hurt, and worry on a parent's face is translated into the child's mind as something's wrong with me. If I am causing discomfort, pain to the person who loves and cares for me the most, I must be the problem. I must be bad and wrong. This is why I constantly talk about the fact that it's a parent's job to take care of themselves in therapy and in meetings, wherever they do, so that when they come to the child, they're a resource to the child, right? They can provide for, hold space for, contain the child. But if we come raw, unfiltered with our energy and we give it to the child, we express it, and many of us do that. Many of us, I say this generation after generation, we have been taught to parent this way, that I'm going to tell my child my upsetness to let them know that they're doing the wrong thing. I'm going to tell them when I'm happy and proud to tell them that they're doing the right thing, right? That's our principal culture in parenting. And if we get a really polished version of sharing that, like the I feel statements, then I'm going to do it nearly perfectly. And the child's job is something else. The child's job is to become a self, right? To speak, to be there and express their true selves, their feelings, their thoughts, their ideas. And so you can see how those two things come into conflict. The belief that a child has that when they upset somebody, something's wrong with them, and the need to express themselves. And so what do? They develop symptoms to express those things, right? They develop indirect ways of expressing themselves. This is true of all of us. We learn what we needed to be as children to fit in, and have performed that role ever since. We develop what Alice Miller from the book, The Drama of the Gifted Child, calls the false self, right? We learn what it takes to be loved and to fit in. So as a therapist, therapy is something quite different from our mainstream culture, what we're taught. Therapy is learning to respect the defenses, to understand them, to listen to them. Understanding the defenses helps us to understand the wound. We follow it like a trail of crumbs back to the original wound. And we provide a safe place for that to be expressed. And when that happens, healing happens, transformation happens. And it's difficult as a parent. I always say I'm much better as a parent than I am. I'm much better as a therapist than I am as a parent, because some of the wounds are from me. And that's hard to deal with or to take in as a parent. And because I don't want my children to feel pain, even when the wound isn't from me, I feel anxious, uncomfortable. I try to make them feel better. And in so doing, suggest to them unconsciously that it's wrong, that something's wrong with them, instead of something is real about them. So it's not intuitive. It's not common sense. The capacity to develop a healthy, intimate relationship is absolutely uncommon. The ability to contain somebody is very, very rare, and a very, very difficult, elusive, and a high-level skill to develop. Part of what I wanted to talk about today was the context of all of this idea about vulnerability and how it relates to your children in treatment. You know, you get your updates from the therapist and how they're doing. But more important than the stories about how they are doing is, what does it mean? What's really going on out there? And again, I constantly encourage my therapist to focus less on, and the staff to focus less on the child learning to do the right thing and learning to express themselves. I was out in the group yesterday, and I was talking about this idea and have shared it since with parents and with the staff. This idea that an early supervisor told me that think of therapy as one of two tasks. You're either a solvent or you're a glue, right? If somebody is dysregulated, self-harming, if somebody's in trouble, then you become a glue. You kind of help them get through it. You give them skills and tools to get through it, to manage it, right? DBT therapy is about that. Residential therapy in general, including wilderness therapy, is about that. We're giving them a safe container, right? We're glue. We're putting them back together. But for many people, it's really about being a solvent. And so I said to one of the young men that I was working with yesterday, I want you to write an impact letter to your parents, and I don't want you to worry about getting critiqued. We're not going to critique it at all. I don't care if there's swearing. I don't care if there's blame. Let's just get to what's bothering you. And right now, you're trying to be so good. You got sent to this program because you were doing poorly, badly. And so your solution is you're going to be good. And we need you to get to the truth. We need to get to what's underneath it. And in fact, immediately, he went and wrote five pages, wasn't finished, but 5 pages of his impact letter, and asked me proudly to read it. And I said, "This is a great start." And yes, were there things in the way that he said things that were inappropriate, unhealthy, immature, unpolished? Absolutely. But we started to get closer and closer to the truth. A program recently emailed one of our therapists and said, why did you have this particular student that we just received? Why did you have him write an impact letter to his parents when he hadn't taken full accountability for his choices, for his part of the equation? And in frustration and in sarcasm, I said to my therapist who shared this, that they received this email from a very prominent and well-respected program in the United States. When he said he got this email, I said, how you should answer them is you should say, I had them do it because I studied psychology in college, right? That's the doorway in to somebody's trauma, to somebody's wound, to somebody's hurt, to the thing that's at the core of why they're expressing the symptoms. And if I didn't go on to say all of this, but if you as a program and as a therapist can't hold space for that, if the parents can't hold space for that, it's never going to be fully healed. Somebody has to hold space for that. And it can't be about saying it right or articulating it perfectly. Let's take it messy for now. And we'll get to accountability. In fact, this is a way of modeling accountability, actually, of people being able to listen and hear. It doesn't mean that you condone or agree with everything, but let's give them space. Regression, relapse, flare-ups, and progress. This is not looking at behavior as the treatment goal and not looking at behavior as telling the entire story, not looking at behavior as black and white, all or nothing. This is starting again to listen to what's the behavior telling us? Why is the person doing this? What's going on? Most people think that the solution to mental health and addiction symptoms is don't do the bad thing anymore. I will tell you, because of guilt and shame, because of fear of getting in trouble or being rejected, because of all of those things, most people at any age, in or out of our program, think the solution is don't do that bad thing anymore. I don't think that's it. I think the solution is you've got to do something else, right? So it's not about not drinking. You may need to not drink. It could kill you. Of course, you may need to not practice self-harm or suicidality. That's true. All of that's true. But if that's all you do, if you just kind of white knuckle grip it and say, I'm not going to do it, it won't work. You've got to replace it with something else. You've got to find an expression for whatever that symptom was covering up, was a manifestation of. It's more than behavior change, right? And if we're to generalize the work that we do here, we have to make a systemic change, don't we? We have to get parents in a place where they can start to hear things from their children, where they can develop a greater capacity to contain their child. I think that's the missing ingredient. And you know what's happening in the United States in treatment programs since I've been doing this? Is because therapists and programs, the people that run them haven't done their work, they don't know this. And what they do is they're just they're just taking what the parents are presenting, and they're trying to kind of realize that the request from the parents. What we're trying to do as Evoke is change the entire paradigm, right? We're trying to say there's something else here. If I just get your kid to stop doing that thing, whatever that thing is, we haven't really done therapy. We haven't really addressed it. Yes, you have to have boundaries and consequences. It's part of being in a family, being in society. They're not exclusive of each other. It's a false dichotomy, right? In fact, what I know is that when we go to the root, when we go to the root issue, when we go past the defenses, right, to the most vulnerable and core pieces of the self, and we treat it with kindness and love and compassion and help whatever that wound is to heal, the symptoms dissipate. There's no need for them anymore. So that's why it's difficult to generalize, because it's like cutting off if you look at the program as a behavioral program, a symptom management program, then it's like cutting a weed off at the surface. It's just going to pop up somewhere else in the garden. And yes, symptoms are dangerous. Symptoms have to be dealt with. The more life-threatening, the more acute they are, the more they have to be managed early on. And the long-term work of therapy is finding that vulnerable middle spot of a person and what they're struggling with. It happens over time, right? It's not automatic. It's not the apology, or it's not the promise that they give you. It happens over time. So you learn to take a step back. You learn to listen and watch what they're doing with different ears. You learn to have a different relationship with yourself, with them, and with their symptoms. And it takes a while to develop this new kind of sensibility. Doing your work is the key, right? It's the foundation. It's not doing your work because you're the one to blame. It's doing your work because if you do, you get to participate in the healing process. Because if you do your work, you develop a more stable, accurate awareness of yourself and of your child, right? And it's not that, again, it's not a causality thing. It's not do your work because you created it. You were one of many, you were a very large part of your child's world as they grew up, but you're not everything. It could happen at school, with peers, with teachers, with society, with social media, all of that stuff. But if you do your work, you become a real big part of the solution. That old cliche that therapists ask clients, tell me about your mother. It's because the mother was the biggest thing in the child's life. It's not because the mother is the origin of all the problems. It's not a blame thing. It's just, let's go there. We know that was there. Let's talk about that. And if the mother and then the father and others develop the capacity to see and hear the child can heal. The child can say, this is where I'm hurting. This is what I'm angry about. And if a parent develops enough capacity to metabolize that, then the child starts to realize themselves more. We ask you to write your life story and your letter of accountability as a model for them, right? Model for them the ability to take accountability to not be right. I remember my therapist said to me in a very critical moment, I fumbled with one of my children when they were giving me their version of the impact letter. And I really fumbled badly at first. And I felt so horrible about it. Now, this was not too long ago, just a few years ago. And I was talking to my therapist, and she said to me, it's probably good that you made a mistake. It's probably more helpful to your daughter that you made the mistake and have to apologize than got it right again. It really helped me to shift and say, I'm not going to try to do it wrong on purpose, but there's more value in me saying I'm sorry, in this case, than if I got it right in the first place. They can see my humanness. I talk about this in marriage therapy. I talk about it in parenting. People don't need perfect partners or perfect parents. If they do, everybody is doomed. What they need is somebody who's able and willing to own their humanness. Somebody that can say, I'm sorry, I messed up. I didn't give you what you needed. Thanks for telling me. Tell me more. Learning to make amends. I talk about this all the time. If I were to give a universal assignment to folks, I would say just apologize to your children for something. Right? And if you can't think of something, ask your spouse or your ex-spouse. They can help you. Just apologize for something. And again, apologizing doesn't need erase accountability. Doesn't need at all to erase your boundaries. That's that false dichotomy. We're afraid because we grew up in the family and we created a family where if I'm wrong, I can't hold others around me accountable for their behavior. If I'm wrong, if I've made mistakes, I can't have a boundary. If I'm wrong and I've made mistakes, you can use that as an excuse. Not true at all. Completely unnecessary dichotomy. The strongest version of this is say, I mess up all the time, and it would be hard to be my son or my daughter or my spouse. I get it. I'm sorry. I'm working on it. I'm going to continue to struggle. I'll try to own it every time. Oh, and by the way, I'm not okay with this. I'm not okay with that. I'm not okay with the other. And here's my boundary. Both can be true. We have to confront our own shame, our own blame, and our own fear, right? We really, for most of us, for the difficulty that we find in doing our own work, that idea of doing our own work, the more difficult it is for us is because, again, we grew up in a context where that was about shame, blame, and fear. I've told you folks the story of giving a public address recently in front of my mother, where my mother came up to me and my brother afterwards and said, I think I'm listening to you talk. I think I should feel guilty for some of the things I did in raising you boys, she said to us. And I said, Mom, it would be fantastic and wonderful if you were aware of your shortcomings and saw all the ways that you hurt us growing up. That would be wonderful for you and for us. The guilt is not necessary, though. You don't need to feel guilty. That's your stuff, your background. That's what your parents taught you was the solution, was to feel guilty. In fact, I explained to her, the feeling of guilt is probably going to get in the way of you exploring and discovering where you messed up. So it's actually going to be a part of the problem of developing and growing as a parent, not part of the solution. So that's what gets in the way, is that we grew up in families where being right was the thing, right? Not in families where being a self was the thing. Noticing your own part, your resistance, your work, your relapse, regressions, and flare-ups. I was in therapy with my son about a year ago, and I was bothered because it seemed like every week we would start off the session, the therapist would start off in the family therapy session with accountability for my son. And I thought, how come I'm not talking about accountability? How come my wife isn't talking about her accountability? Because we screwed up several times this week, each of us. So when it was my turn to share, I said, I'm so focused on what I'm doing right and wrong. I'm not focused on everything that you're doing and struggling with. And I want that to be on the table. If you focus on something you can control, like your resistance and your work and your relapse, your regression, your flare-ups, you focus on something you can control, and those are very hard things, but they're essentially within your control. You don't feel powerless. You don't feel anxious or depressed. You feel empowered, liberated. And then you operate from a much, much stronger and secure place with your child. Focusing on what you can control has to cause you anxiety because you can't control it. Although some of us are very, very, very good at controlling things. So we get indulged, we get intoxicated by how effective we are as manipulators. How good enough parents can benefit from doing their own work. Good enough is a phrase that was used to describe parents that weren't toxic, that weren't creating big T trauma, kind of your average run of the mill parent that was good enough. I don't like that phrase very much because the word good still bothers me. I would rather talk about human parents and imperfect parents and fallible parents, right? Just the idea that we have to be good enough, placated and soothed with that enough. Still, I think we're not quite addressing our own shame in that. But having said that, we can still work on ourselves, right? And if we have something to work on, if we're making amends, then our child doesn't experience the idea, the sense that they're fundamentally the problem and flawed. I said to the boys yesterday, I said, all of you guys have made mistakes and deserve to be here. No doubt about that. And we'll focus on helping you deal with those things and the things that cause those things. But you're okay. You're okay. I make mistakes. I've made more than you, as a matter of fact. And in some cases, much worse than you. But we're all okay and we're all in this together. So there's a compassionate presentation, a compassionate idea about treating mental health. I skipped the point there about the panel and the consultant's objection. It was where one of the consultants somebody was talking about this idea that so many of our children, even the angry ones, the ones that have acted out, that there's a great deal of wisdom in their anger. And one of the consultants objected to that passionately. That if we don't pathologize the anger, the acting out, we indulge the child, right? We're abdicating responsibility for teaching them the right thing. And again, this particular consultant wasn't coming from a clinical, psychologically informed perspective. They were coming from a place of fear, coming from kind of common sense thinking, and that's not what therapy should be. You learn something by going to therapy that you cannot learn any other way. I've told the story of a good friend and colleague for years, through some pretty significant trauma, refused to go to therapy, tried to use me as his therapist, tried to use his own being a therapist as his therapy. And I would say to him over and over again, sitting on the other couch is different. It's different. It's not about an exchange of information. It's about the experience of vulnerability, of taking the risk. It's what Viktor Frankl talked about. It's not about the idea that of listening to difficult things. It's the idea of saying difficult things. That's what therapy really is about. And if you find yourself aversive and resistant to the 12-step meetings that we ask you to go to, I'm not talking about because of time, legitimate time concerns, but literally, if you find yourself resistant to going to a therapist, to going to 12-step meetings, to going to some of the parent workshops and activities, that's the same feeling that your child has. And they use the same reasons. I don't need it. The other people aren't like me. I can do what I need to do some other way. Walking into a therapy session, sitting down on the couch, and talking about yourself is a scary endeavor. And we fear judgment, right? It's a vulnerable place, and there's no other substitute for it. The podcasts, self-help books, those things can be helpful introduction. They can augment therapy, but it's not the same thing as going to therapy. And frankly, most therapists don't do it either. It should be universal, right? Ideally, if you're a therapist, it should be required. I was over in London in the UK, and that is, I don't know if it was mandated, but it was nearly mandated that you had to do your own work as a part of it. In the United States, not at all. And therapists really who don't do it don't understand what it feels like. That's why I say, when you go to these meetings, you go to these things, one thing by going, what your child feels like. Being sent or compelled to come to a program like ours, you know what it feels like. And you can have more empathy and respect for what's being asked of them by you and by us. Not understanding your child. Genuine confusion versus frustration and judgment communicated by the expression, I don't understand them. When people say that, I listen for that tone. I listen for the distinction. Is it really about not understanding, or is I don't understand them a subtle way of saying they're insane or stupid or ridiculous? And the way that you know which is if it's just genuine confusion and commonplace ignorance, then a really well thought out explanation is going to satisfy you. But most of the time we say that it's shame centered. It's intended to shame them. And so ask yourself that. My therapist calls it pseudo stupidity. It's not really about not knowing, right? It's not really not getting it. It's just that we don't like the answer. Abraham Tversky, the author of Addictive Thinking, talked about it this way. He said, it's when the client says to you, what's 1+1, but don't tell me 2. Because I can't listen to that. I can't hear that. And so when I talk about doing your own work, it's what makes the biggest difference. It really is. It's the most significant contribution that you can make to your child's well-being is doing your own work, not because of cause, but because of the context that gets created from that, the capacity that gets created from that, the calmness and the soothing that comes from that, and all of that adds to the equation going forward. And let me say this, one of my pet peeves about parent work is how shaming it can be innately. Nothing makes me more angry than watching therapists and programs shame, belittle, talk down to parents. It drives me crazy. Why would you do that? Anything that the parent struggles with, I don't care how inconvenient it is for you. I don't care how much you want to make it about the fact that it's hurting the child. Anything that a parent comes with that contributes to the problem in any way comes from their wounding, right? And so, in other words, you're getting angry at somebody who's injured. And you're justifying it because it's getting in the way of the progress of the work that you want to make with the child. So how dare you? How dare you treat these parents with that kind of derision and then hide behind the therapists, the psychological language that you learned in graduate school? So I feel protective of you all in that way. And I'm with you. I'm one of you. You know, it's that old idea of there is such a thing as a perfect parent. They just don't have any children. Right? We're all in this together. We're all in this together. Sometimes to understand your child or to understand another, you have to lose your mind, in a sense. This quote that I love that I saw on social media, the first thing you need to understand about me is that I'm not you. A lot more will make sense after that, right? You have to kind of see it from their perspective and stop trying to find objective truth or agreed upon truth and say, I want to hear the dream that you had about me. Tell me about the dream that you have about me. And I don't mean literal dream. I'm using that as a metaphor for tell me the story about me that you have in your head. I want to hear it. I want to understand it. Because it will help me, if I understand it, to make sense about what you're doing and why you're doing it. We become students. That's what that lose your mind idea is about. We become students. We develop a beginner's mind and develop curiosity. And really, like Carl Jung taught us, the great therapist taught us, the great psychologist taught us, to understand the darkness of others, we just need to understand our own darkness. And the more I look into it, I said this to the boys yesterday, the more I look into it, the more I realize how alike you I am. And while the details, the small brushstrokes, if you will, are different, I haven't done all that you've done, I'm fundamentally the same. And I can see that. And I can have empathy and patience while still having my boundary, of course. This actually came from a parent. One time who said to me, by the way, you've changed my life. Turned it upside down, actually. Big thanks. This work really does turn us upside down. It challenges so many assumptions that are so prolific in our culture, in our society, and in other cultures, frankly. And so we have to unlearn so many things. So many things that we were taught were part of the solution, like guilt or shame or telling your children how you feel, right? So many of those things that we learned. The adage that you're only as happy as your least happy child. A former client sent me this quote that she found on social media that said something like, your mother might not have enough time to say prayers for herself because she's so busy praying for you. Something like that. And this person sent it to me, sent a screenshot of it to me and said, just reminding you of what we all grew up with, what not only were we codependent, but we aspired to be codependent. We were taught, and it was suggested to us that that was the highest form of love. That anxious attachment, or what people have tried to call loving too much, was something to aspire to. That being selfless was a high calling for a parent. So we have to challenge those things. And to be challenged, we have to be in contact with somebody who has in themselves challenged those things. Showing up as your naked self, being authentic, is the scary thing. It takes work. It provides connection and validation to other people. Right? It's the idea. Somebody reminded me of this idea from the author of the book The Chosen. That it's in our specific stories, our real, honest stories of vulnerability, that make the broadest connection in society. If I tell you my own private, specific story of pain and vulnerability and shame, if I'm willing to tell you that, it has the broadest effect on society. It feels foreign and out of control. And it's the best defense. The more I do this work, the more I grow older. I just am more comfortable with this is just me. The more I do battle with shame and guilt, I can tell the truth about, even when I make a mistake, about what my intention was. That I was feeling insecure or afraid or worried what you would think or feel or whatever it is. I can start to just tell the truth. But I had to do a lot of work to start to make progress in that area. I've told the story about the dad in the lecture that he called me and said, I know I'm not supposed to lecture my son, but he keeps making the same mistakes. So I gave him a lecture. And I said, just remember what you just said. You said to your son, I know I'm not supposed to. You told me, I know I'm not supposed to lecture, but my son keeps making the same mistake. So I went in and gave him a lecture. Now, go back in there and tell your son, you know exactly why he keeps making the same mistake, because you just did it too. I loved when this parent was on a parent visit and with her son, and they were visiting colleges. And she was talking about some of the things that her son was saying about the different colleges and why he would prefer one over the other. And she said to me, Brad, the point of my story is not to tell you what he was doing, because some of the stuff he was doing sounded like his old self, pre-wilderness self. But what I'm telling you is that I responded differently. When he did it, I didn't react. I didn't get anxious or triggered. I just listened. And the outcome was better too. But I wanted to tell you how proud I was that I did it differently. So the focus wasn't on whether or not their son was regressing. The focus was on her regression or the lack thereof. People will tell me all the time that if I open up, I won't be put back together, right? That fear. That if I do begin to experience and express the things that I have hidden, that it'll be out of control. People talk about, in fact, Brene Brown talks about in her most famous TED Talk, she talks about the idea that she had an emotional breakdown And she said, my therapist called it a spiritual awakening. And they really are one and the same in many cases, right? Crossing thresholds, going through something, facing something that we're sure is going to kill us. That becomes a part of a beautiful story in us. Like I said, if for nothing else, do your own work so you know what it's like for your child. You know what your child what you're asking them to do. We do teach skills, and part of the transition is the way that you talk to them, the skills that you use. But most of it is how you are in the world. It will take work and discomfort, and in the end, you will be transformed. Old things will die, and new things will be born. That's the gift of parenting a child struggling with mental health and addiction. Right? Those of you who have been at this a little bit longer, you know that. You've realized that. Those of you that are new to it think that I'm crazy. Somebody said to me, it's a really, really, really wonderful gift wrapped in the worst package of all, of having a child that struggles with mental health or addiction. I've had people that told me that they refound God in all of this, their spiritual selves. Most people that I deal with who stick with it and lean into it a little bit will say it changed their entire life. It's hard work. It's really, really hard work. It's uncommon work. It's not common sense. It's complex. But when you go through it, you learn something you can't learn any other way. That's the experience of it. Going into therapy, having an addicted child. You can't learn those lessons any other way. Others who have gone through it ahead of you can share a little bit of hope about what it looks like, but the experience is the thing. And what you'll find in the end is a new version of yourself, a deeper, richer, more authentic, courageous, serene version of yourself. People ask me all the time, how do you do it? How do you transform from the negative self-talk, the anxiety, the insecurity, the shame, the fear? How does it change? And the answer is you have to spend time with somebody that can see you. You can't do it on your own. Self-esteem is not an inside job. You have to take the risk of showing up. And the risk is that you're going to be treated the way that you were when you were younger and in other contexts. And if you get lucky and you have an adequate therapist, they'll just see you and have compassion for you. And then that, over time, will start to make a difference. That, over time, will start to become a part of you where you know you're okay. Doesn't mean you're perfect, you're just okay. Enough. So you have to get into a safe space. My article on what to look for in a therapist talks about this on the website, my website. It's not a therapist who fixes you. It's a therapist who sees and understands you. And then the fixing just happens through that process. I was talking to somebody just today. My therapist has shared with me that she went through 18 years of analysis. And I've said this before, but listen to this idea. Just think about this. 18 years. 2 to 3 times a week. So Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, 2 to 3 times a week, going to the same person, the same analyst, and saying the same things. Nothing new or entertaining. Nothing has changed. Same old ridiculous self showing up. And the therapist doesn't fire you, graduate you, tell you not to come, get tired of you. And what does that do? That heals you. You're welcome there every time. You're seen. And you don't have to, for the first time in your life, be something that you're not so that the person in front of you is okay, isn't upset or bored or agitated or annoyed or impatient. That's what it is. And it doesn't have to be analysis. It's the same kind of therapy that I teach at Evoke and that we try to do, just to see and to hear. Yes, we have the tools and the skills and the concepts that are part of many of the theories, but the essential piece is you've got to be received with non-judgment and compassion and understanding. And it changes everything. That's the thing. Being with that kind of a person in that context changes everything over time. All right. I'll take live questions. And then let me go over the updates, and then I'll take live questions at the end. We ask you all to go to 6 12-step support groups, Al-Anon, Codependents Anonymous, or Families Anonymous. You can also go to adultchildren.org. There's Alateens for teenagers. Refuge Recovery is a Buddhist-inspired, not focused as much on a higher power recovery program. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI.org, offers free classes and resources in your area. Follow us on social media. All of these broadcasts are available on podcast app, any podcast app. Just search Evoke Therapy Programs, or go to your computer and go to soundcloud.com and follow us there. If you subscribe to our podcast, it will automatically alert you when new ones are posted. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram using the handle @EvokeTherapy. You can also follow the Evoke Summit Lodge on Instagram using the handle @Evoke Summit Lodge. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs. The Alumni Foundation is for an organization of alumni families that raise money to help people that can't afford treatment. They put several people through therapeutic programs at this point. So if you want to get back or become involved, go to the Evoke Family Foundation on Facebook. Our blog has new content each week. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon. If you want to do a deep dive, if you're ready to do a deep dive into your own work, Finding You is the place to do it. We have Finding You 2 upcoming this Sunday. I think we might be full with that one, but if you haven't signed up now, you're probably not signing up. Finding You is the first one. The next one is June 26th through 30th. I know we have a couple of spots left there. So if you want to do a deep dive, that's a great place to go. Parent support groups, most of these are tentative. I will be in New York on Monday, June 17th from 7 to 9 p.m. The Bay Area, I'm looking at July 15th. Chicago, I'm looking at July 29th. In Southern California, I'm looking at August 11th. We'll confirm those next week when I do the broadcast. We ask all families to come to a workshop. The next one I think is full. June 15th and 16th is full. The one following that will be at our Entrada location. For all of the intensives, all of the parent support groups, and all of the workshops, contact Melanie at evoketherapy.com for more information and to RSVP. Pursuits trips are trips for families and young adults. Think Therapy Light. And the next broadcast will be Adjusting to Out-of-Home Placement. This is for newer parents. Thursday, June 13th, a week from tonight at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. All right, I'm happy to take any live questions that have come in. Let's see. One parent says, you're not ever completely transformed. You are always transforming if you are doing your work. Good point. Having recently moved to California, I, as a parent, am looking for a therapist. Please remind me what specialty or type of therapist I should be looking for. Google my name, Brad Reedy, and what to look for in a therapist. And there's an article that will pop up. It's from drbradreedy.com. So you can just go straight there and go to my blog where I talk about a therapist that can adequately see you. One parent writes, how I wish I knew this before our son went to Evoke. It would have been easier for him and I would have been a far better parent. 8 years later, I'm still doing my work. I always will. Let me just comment on that comment. That's what people say that are doing their work. I'm never transformed. I'm still working on it. Parents that haven't done that work talk about how good they are. I make this joke often that when somebody tells me they have a good childhood, they had a really good childhood, my response is, well, with some therapy, we can fix that. And it's another way of saying that the more we lean into our work, the more we say things like you just said, which is, you're still working on it 8 years later. Wonderful. Thank you. I discovered Brene Brown 4 months ago. Now it connects it to being a parent of an addicted child. Really hard vulnerability, and it really brings it back all to myself. Absolutely. And again, I just want to be clear that the broadcast was about vulnerability, but the vulnerability is about doing your own work, right? It's about getting past the sentinels of shame and guilt and judgment that we carry around in us because of our own childhoods that allow us to look at ourselves. And when you do it, you'll say things like these parents, which are, I'm never fully transformed. I'm still working on it. Yes, I wish I knew it earlier. And now I'm working on it. And I realize more today what I need to work on. So, and then Lindsay has just posted the link to the article. Thank you, Lindsay. The link to the article for what to look for in a therapist. So appreciate that. All right, folks. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. Again, it's not a substitute for therapy, but it's an invitation into the work. However you do your work, I like therapy as a way of doing my work, but it's doing your work, and to do all of the things that we offer. So the next one will be on June 13th, a week from tonight, 7 p.m. Mountain Time, adjusting to out-of-home placement. Take care. Nice to be with you tonight. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.